Chapter 1. Friday, April 20th, 2012. Residence of Professor James Campbell, 8:44 p.m. Gwen Chapel hesitated by her vehicle, staring up at the house through water-drenched lids. She was trying to prepare herself for the next leg of her journey, and though she'd just driven 300 miles that afternoon, it seemed a more daunting task to walk those final 30 steps to Dr. Campbell's front door. She hated the rain more now than ever before, and it felt like 1,000 icy fingers clawing at her face and exposed legs. Her only choices were to retreat back to her car's safety, or brave that long trek to the door and hope Campbell let her in. There was always that possibility, given their last exchange over the phone, and she knew that her journey might very well end with her pounding on his door as the rain slowly drowned her. Pulling her thin wool coat tighter, she pressed forward with unsure footing, legs wobbling like a newborn calf's, face turned towards the ground. She didn't dare look up at the water for fear of what she might see there, and likewise, she didn't dare look back at the car that offered her refuge, or she would surely retreat. Halfway to the door, her courage and legs gave out simultaneously, and she sprawled upon the pavement with an anguished cry that was muffled by the falling water. Trembling white knuckles and slender outstretched fingers met the hard ground, sacrificing a bit of flesh, but they were strong enough to break her fall. She saw the eyes upon her through a veil of auburn-red hair, a heavy downpour, and 2 thick panes of glass. He'd witnessed the entire affair beneath the motion light, exposing her struggle and her humility. Pride forced strength back into her slender arms and legs, and she made the long climb back up as the rain whispered in her ear, telling her to stay down. Gwen Chapel would never listen to that voice or abandon her husband's crusade as the man in the window had. She didn't drown on the porch, after all, the door swinging open after the first knock. The man greeted her in his usual fashion. A faint, uncomfortable smile, brief eye contact, and the customary glance downward at her legs. Campbell wasn't the sort to be so intrusive. He was just a man who paid attention to details and reduced things to their most basic components. In this case, thanks to her husband, those components were her legs and eyes. She hoped that he'd forgotten John's descriptiveness and was simply noticing the bloody scrape on her left knee. I'm sorry, I lost my footing." He met her gaze again and managed an oddly warm reply. "It seems that those I've had at my door recently, Mrs. Chapel, have all lost their footing." A smile peeked through the auburn-red hair plastered to her face. She pushed it out of the way with the back of her hand, revealing a face that looked like that of a frightened child, not one belonging to a woman in her mid-30s. "You weren't out there long, I hope?" he asked innocently. "About 10 minutes. I wanted to tidy up the place. You called last minute." "It's okay. I saw you watching from the window." His face turned red. "I wouldn't let me in either, given the circumstances," she said, lowering her eyes, somewhat embarrassed as well. "I just thought this new information would help us figure out what happened to him." She produced the rain-spattered notebook she'd been clutching in her right hand. His eyes were called back again from her legs to the collection in her hand, and they seemed to glimmer when he saw the new pages tucked neatly inside, bound with rubber bands. He tried to gently take the book, but her fingers clung tightly. The notes she carried would either be a Rosetta Stone, unlocking the cryptic pages already in Campbell's possession, or would only shroud the truth further in darkness. And that's what scared her the most. With a trembling hand, she finally released the pages to him as he invited her inside. He seemed not to care that she was dripping on an expensive-looking Turkish rug as he took her coat. His eyes were fixed on the notebook as he hung her coat on the rack beside the door, and he began thumbing through the pages as she unzipped her leather boots. Her host was as engrossed in the pages as she was in the tastes of his decorator, and she complimented the perfect blending of dark maple accents, antique brass fixtures, and pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. A banister spiraled up winding steps to her right, ascending to a balcony that overlooked the foyer, and then disappeared into the shadows above. Campbell waited patiently for her to finish her small talk about his taste in decor, and then indicated the double doors beyond. Moving to the study and motioning for her to follow along the dimly lit hall, her eyes moved from the Victorian wallpaper to his antique covering, and she tried guessing the age of both. She knew he was well into his 60s, But those years had been kind to James Campbell, and most guessed he was a decade younger. However, his bones revealed the truth that his skin tried to hide, and she noticed that not all of the groaning and creaking came from the beautiful old wood floors. "Oh my," she whispered when they entered the room. A fireplace cast a warm orange glow over the comfortable-looking chairs, the many shelves of books, and the antique desk against the far wall. From the mantel, the chime of an old clock echoed through the dozen or so picture frames there, filled with memories as warm as the fire below. In one corner was a divan upholstered in the same pattern as the Turkish rug in the entranceway, and it was the centerpiece of a room designed to inspire serenity and a relaxed state for those who entered. The choice of wallpaper on the far wall disrupted that serenity. Dozens of her husband's handwritten pages were tacked up there, covered with just as many sticky notes and thumbtacks of varying colors. Passages were highlighted, circled, and connected by intersecting red and black lines, making the wall look like a giant Cincinnati road map. Most disturbing, though, were the many pairs of cold, graphite eyes staring back at her. She still saw those faces in nightmares despite telling John to take them down from the walls of his workshop behind the house, and they startled her no less now than they did that day she'd first discovered them. She never knew exactly where they had been exiled to, but Campbell's study was the perfect place for them. The room had been transformed into a shrine to the dead, as well as to those who'd never lived. He searched for the words to explain the room and its present condition, but she didn't need an explanation or apology. "I thought I was the only one who lost this much sleep," she said, gazing up at the bizarre map on the wall behind the desk. "He really did tell you everything." "Almost everything." He indicated the notes in his hand. "Where did you get these?" She turned to meet his gaze with sparkling amber eyes, the firelight making them shimmer the way John had often described them. He'd said that they reminded him of a whiskey bottle with a bright beam of sunlight shining through it. "Merrill Lake," she replied in the same reverent whisper her husband had used whenever he spoke about the place. It was hallowed ground to them, John especially, and a place which still held many secrets. Some had gone to get away from the world there, others to find rebirth, and a few to find something else. He'd never known exactly what happened there the night he last spoke with John about it, telling him with an unsettling urgency in his tone that he had to return there. Now he had John's actual account of those events in his hands, possibly the key to completing that broken map on his wall. He offered a seat to Gwen as he grabbed a blackened iron rod that was leaning against the hearth. A sudden chill had settled over the room that bit through his double layer of sweaters. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Campbell," she said, as she had just noticed the face of the antique clock on the mantel. "I just got caught up in the excitement of the day. I had no idea it was this late." As he prodded at the dwindling fire, he reassured her, "It's okay. I'm not sleeping much these days either, and I could use the company. I was just getting used to him being here to talk to, and now that old chair has sat empty too many nights." "He sat in this chair," she whispered. "One and the same," he said, replacing the poker and creaking across the room towards his desk. From a bar service adjacent to the far wall, he retrieved a bottle of brandy and a towel, handing them to her as he gave a nod towards her leg. "I don't think I'll need this. It's not that bad," she said. "Might want to hold on to it just the same," he said in a low voice. She set the bottle on the small table beside her chair, scooted back, got comfortable, and stroked her fingers delicately over the wide leather arms. Resting her head against the high back and closing her eyes, she looked very cozy in her husband's old chair, though he doubted it was because of the quality of the leather. "Is that your famous brandy John used to rave about?" "Oh no, if you'd like the good stuff, I can fetch it for you," he offered. "I brought that bottle for your knee. The other stuff would be properly served in a warm glass and is much better for chasing away miserable nights like this one." She waved away his hospitality, saying, "I'm fine for the time being. When he came home after visits with you, I could smell it on him, and the smell on the towel just now reminded me of him." Her nostrils flared, trying to pick up his scent, but she couldn't find it beneath the smell of damp air, musty books, aged cedar, and pipe tobacco. "He spent many nights here when he should have been home with you." It sounded like an apology. He didn't find much comfort at home or pretty much anywhere else besides this room and this chair. "I couldn't help him, Dr. Campbell, and he knew that—" "Jim," he corrected her. "Jim," she repeated, as if it was funny that he had a real first name. You were the one he turned to. He thought you could save him. Save both of us. That's why I came here as soon as I found the letters." The thin smile completely shriveled into a sullen frown as he sat heavily back into his chair, scooping the letters back up. "I don't know that what's in here will bring us any closer to the answers we're looking for, Gwen. I hope you're not putting too much faith in these pages." "I don't have faith in much these days, Jim, and what I did read didn't make much sense. That's why I brought them to you." He let out a long sigh and took his reading glasses from the pocket of his tweed, fixing them on the bridge of his nose. Unfolding the letters, he glanced over them again, then lowered them, pausing for verification. "You're sure you want to start this tonight?" She nodded eagerly. It was all I could do not to pull off to the side of the road and read every page on the way here. "Gwen, I'm as eager to see what's on these pages, and will do my very best to incorporate that information into what we already know about your husband's case." She didn't want to hear what came next. Her hands were clasped as if begging or in some prayer, knuckles turning white, and she squeezed her eyes closed just as tightly against his words. But John's unique situation makes it difficult to consider any primary source material as valid. "By unique situation, you mean crazy," she said, leveling a set of smouldering amber eyes at him. "Even with this new information, because of this information, it could make it that much more difficult to sort out that confusing mess behind you." "But you haven't even read—" "Gwen, I can't even give these pages a serious look until I've made some sense of the others," he said, indicating the strange montage on the far wall. "There are still too many unknowns, too many loose ends, and those need to be brought to a close before we begin asking new questions." Gwen furrowed her brow at him. "So you didn't even have all the information, and yet you were able to diagnose my husband with a mental illness." "I'm a history professor, not a shrink, but he insisted that I take a look at his journal anyway and help him make sense of it," he explained, raising a brow at her. "The things he was writing about, well, I didn't need a psychology degree to know that he needed a different sort of help." "Did you even bother checking the things he asked you to?" she asked, trying to hide her agitation. "I used every resource available, despite it going against what I believed in. The place he talked about and the people he communicated with never existed, not on any map or in any recorded document." "You looked in a few history books and didn't see any proof there," she said disgustedly. "So you flipped through his journal, found a few passages about a troubled childhood, and told him that was explanation enough for what was happening to him." "I wanted to believe in him, I really did, and out of respect for him and for our friendship, I listened to him and weighed all the facts. In the end, there just wasn't enough proof, and all signs pointed to the diagnosis that neither of you wanted to hear. Dissociative identity disorder." She spat the diagnosis from her lips like a bitter drink. "You and I both know that didn't even begin to describe what he was experiencing. People don't just begin speaking and writing in dead languages, Jim." "They also don't speak to the dead in the rain," he said, glaring at her over the rim of his glasses. "There are 26 faces up there on that wall. 26 faces that he created in his own mind to hide behind, Gwen." "Hiding from what?" she demanded. Campbell held up the rain-spattered journal she'd handed him at the door. She frowned at it and shifted uncomfortably in her seat like her predecessor had when he'd mentioned particular journal pages. There were things that neither of them had wanted to revisit, but things that needed to be brought to light. He almost had me convinced that there was something more to all of this, and that what he was experiencing couldn't be explained through the known sciences. I almost overlooked her. She'd seen the charcoal drawing of the girl he was referring to, hanging on the back wall amidst those other 25 eerie likenesses. Campbell watched her as she studied his exhibit, following her eyes as they moved over each face. There was no mistaking her expression when they came to rest on the carbon face of the beautiful woman. The blue sticky note affixed to the corner read, "Number 26, but she knew all too well the name that was attached to that face. Melinda Malowski. That name was written on the wall behind them no less than 300 times. She scowled and dug her fingers into the arms of the chair, as though looking for a hand to grab for comfort. "This isn't about her, and you know it. You even told John—" "You're right," he said, flipping the journal open as she watched nervously. "I thought she was at the heart of John's affliction, but as it turns out, there's someone else. Isn't there? Someone else he just couldn't quite find closure with." The fire was recovering nicely and chasing away the chill of the room, yet she gave a little shudder and pulled a plaid felt blanket from the back of the chair to drape over her legs. That was 30 years ago, she protested. My husband came to terms with what happened that day at the park long ago. Even Melinda's mother forgave him. It doesn't mean that he forgave himself, he interjected. In fact, I think he created this other place and everyone in it for the sole purpose of finding that forgiveness. You're wrong about him, Jim, she said with a smugly defiant expression. He wasn't hiding. When there seem to be no answers and things have become too much for us to bear, we hide within ourselves as John did, or behind faith, and ignore the truth. What are you hiding from, Mrs. Chappell? I have nothing to hide, she said with indignation. I'm here to find answers, Jim, so I can finally get a decent night's rest and go on with my life. If faith was enough for me and I could find some comfort there, I wouldn't be here talking to you, I'd be talking with Hal McDonnell. He glanced down at the letters he'd left on the side table again, giving her a condescending smile as he continued. But what answers are you looking for, Gwen? Are you sure you didn't skim through these pages searching for an answer to that most nagging of questions? Settle up the old debt. The souring of her expression said she was well aware of the debt he was referring to, while the crease of her brow and her downturned lip said she didn't care for his inference. Leaning forward so that he would not mistake the seriousness in her face or miss a word over the fire's crackling, she did hissing and popping of her own. Dr. Campbell, I'm not here to settle some sophomoric pissing match with my old best friend. John and I had our share of problems, and our marriage was far from perfect, but it wasn't Melinda Malowski that took him from me. It was something else. Okay, he said, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. If you're serious about this, then I need you to be completely honest, with me and with yourself, and hold nothing back. She nodded slowly as she seemed to grasp exactly what was going to take place over the next few hours. They were going to have to revisit some very difficult things, and it would most likely be one of the longest, most difficult nights she would experience since she'd received the news that her husband wasn't coming home anymore. Again, outstretched fingers searched for hands that weren't there, preparing herself for what came next. He creaked back over towards the bar service, leaving her to gather her thoughts. Returning a moment later, he handed her a warm glass filled halfway with a liquid that shone with the same hue as her eyes as it caught the firelight. I don't care for brandy, Dr. Campbell. John said the same thing, he said with a chuckle. You'll want it before this discussion is over. She took a sip of the strong brandy, making a sour face as she did, letting out a long, sterile breath, and asked, Where do you want to begin? 30 years ago, page 1. Tell me about the day he was so reluctant to talk about. Tell me about the afternoon of February the 12th, and the boys that were lost that day.